working, you lazy dogs. I want this field cleared by sundown.
Slavery was once the backbone of economies across the world, a horrific practice so widespread that for millennia, nobody seriously questioned it. It powered kingdoms and empires, built cities, and filled treasuries, all on the backs of people stripped of freedom and humanity. Slave owners grew rich while the enslaved were beaten, sold, and worked to death. The world looked away because slavery was profitable, and profit drowned out conscience. So the question is, what could possibly make the powerful give up a system that made them rich for centuries? What finally pushed the world to end a crime it had accepted for thousands of years? What forced humanity to confront its own evil and let slavery fall? If you're thinking it's simply because people realized it was evil, or because a famous leader like Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, history tells a much more complex story. In reality, slavery died for a combination of reasons, and not because humanity just suddenly became morally better. Today, we'll uncover what truly brought slavery down and expose the pressures and events that finally broke a system that once seemed unstoppable. This is a story of Black history, power, and truth, and it may change how you view one of the greatest moral transformations in human history. Before we go further, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Here, we reveal the hidden histories of struggle and change that made our world what it is today. Join a community that brings light to the stories of resistance and liberation that history tried to bury. Now let's get into the video. For thousands of years, slavery was treated as normal. Virtually every society practiced slavery in some form. The ancient Greeks and Romans kept slaves as servants, miners, and gladiators. Powerful empires in China, India, and the Middle East all enslaved people. African kingdoms enslaved war captives and traded them. Even many Native American cultures had slaves captured from rival tribes. No region of the world was untouched. By the 18th century, slavery was especially integral in the New World. European colonial powers had industrialized the practice on plantations. For instance, the French colony of Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, was the richest sugar-producing territory on Earth by the late 1700s, at one point generating more revenue than all 13 American colonies combined. The brutal irony is that the modern concepts of liberty and equality were stirring even as the slave system reached its peak profitability. In short, for most of human history, nobody imagined a world without slavery. It was hugely profitable, socially accepted, and backed by law and religion. So what changed? How did we go from that reality to a world where slavery is almost universally outlawed, at least on paper, by 1900? Many prefer to believe the answer is Abraham Lincoln, or that people simply grew more moral and recognized slavery as evil. But the truth is actually far more complex. Although a gradual change of morals is part of it, the death of slavery was a global process driven by the convergence of many factors. Let's break them down. After millennia of moral acceptance, the late 16th to 18th centuries brought a dramatic change in thinking. Suddenly, voices began to say that slavery was not a natural fact of life, but a profound moral wrong. This moral transformation didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen everywhere at once. But its origins can be traced to the Enlightenment and changing religious attitudes in the West. In the late 1600s and 1700s, European and American intellectuals started talking about universal human rights, liberty, and equality. Philosophers such as John Locke and Voltaire wrote about the rights of man and the principles of reason. These ideas challenged old hierarchies, kings, nobles, and by extension the notion that one human could own another. However, this new way of thinking did not instantly make philosophers into abolitionists. Their behavior was often hypocritical. John Locke, famous for promoting individual liberty, invested in the slave-trading Royal African Company and even helped write pro-slavery laws in colonial Carolina. Many Enlightenment thinkers treated slavery as an exception or avoided the topic altogether. Even so, the idea had been planted. The Enlightenment introduced the bold notion that governments should follow moral law and respect natural rights, and over time that made slavery harder to defend. At the same time, a slow change was beginning within Christian thought. For centuries, Most churches either tolerated slavery or took part in it. That began to change in the 18th century. One of the first groups to make slavery a moral issue were the Quakers, also called the Religious Society of Friends. Founded in mid-17th century England by George Fox, the Quakers rejected strict church hierarchies and taught that every person carried the inner light of God. This belief made the idea of owning another human being impossible to justify. As early as the late 1600s, Quakers in Pennsylvania and London began questioning whether slavery was righteous, and by the 1700s, they banned their members from owning slaves. They issued some of the first formal religious condemnations of slavery, spreading pamphlets and petitions that called it a sin against God's law. At a time when most churches were silent or complicit, the Quakers stood out as some of the earliest and loudest voices for abolition. This was a wave of religious energy that swept through Britain and the American colonies, filling churches and open fields with fiery preachers who urged people to embrace personal faith, seek salvation, and take moral responsibility for the world around them. In this charged atmosphere, many newly devoted Christians, especially in the northern United States and in Britain, felt compelled to confront society's deepest sins, and slavery quickly became one of their first and most urgent targets. By the early 1800s, devout Christians like William Wilberforce in England and many abolitionists in America saw ending slavery as a God-given mission. They preached that every soul was equal in his eyes, and that enslaving another human being was a moral outrage. Churches that had once twisted scripture to excuse slavery now tore themselves apart over it. In the United States, major denominations like the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians split into northern and southern branches, often directly because of fierce arguments over whether slavery was a sin. The speed of the transformation was striking. In just a few decades, pulpits that once defended or ignored slavery thundered against it, branding it the great national sin. Western Christian abolitionists became the first religious group in history to organize a large-scale movement against slavery. They held revival meetings urging people to repent for the sin of slaveholding and pushed for action beyond the pulpit. Boycotts of slave-produced goods became a moral statement, with one of the most famous being the refusal to buy West Indian sugar made by enslaved laborers, an early example of ethical consumer activism. They gathered mountains of signatures for petitions to their governments, demanding an end to the trade in human lives. In Britain, by 1788, more than 100 petitions flooded Parliament, carrying roughly 60,000 to 100,000 names. By 1792, as many as 100,000 Britons were actively avoiding slave-produced sugar, a huge number for the era and a clear sign that ordinary people were rallying to a moral cause. However, it's important to acknowledge a bit of a paradox here. Western nations led the abolition movement, but they were also the main engines of the slave trade's cruelty. European traders and American plantation owners trafficked and exploited millions of African people for centuries. Britain, France, and the United States don't really deserve praise for ending slavery. They were simply dismantling the horrific system they had built and profited from. Even so, the moral crusade against slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries was largely driven by Western activists, many inspired by their Christian faith, who forced their own societies and others to confront this evil. They recast slavery as a profound violation of both morality and religion. That change in perspective marked the first crack in the foundation of slavery. However, by itself, moral outrage wasn't enough. Condemnation of the practice had existed in some form for centuries. Isolated voices had spoken against it as early as the 4th century, and many people knew it was cruel. But outrage without power changes nothing. What finally gave the moral movement real force were two decisive factors: the relentless resistance of the enslaved themselves and the sweeping changes in global economies and political power that made the old system harder to sustain. It is impossible to discuss the end of slavery without acknowledging slave resistance. Enslaved people were never purely passive victims of their fate. They constantly sought freedom through subtle means and through open revolt, and their resistance made slavery increasingly difficult, dangerous, and costly to maintain. One of the most famous early revolts was led by Spartacus in ancient Rome around 73 to 71 BC, where gladiators and slaves nearly shook the Roman Republic. Such uprisings were rare flickers through the ages, usually crushed brutally. But in the age of revolutions, slave uprisings took on a new scale and shook the world. The biggest of all was the Haitian Revolution. In 1791, the enslaved population of French Saint-Domingue, nearly 500,000 black men and women, rose up in a coordinated rebellion. What began as a violent slave revolt turned into a full-blown 13-year war for freedom and independence from France. Leaders such as Toussaint Louverture, an educated former slave, and later Jean-Jacques Dessalines, transformed scattered rebels into disciplined armies. They defeated invading Spanish and British forces and ultimately crushed the French colonial army. The result was Haiti, the first independent black republic in the Western Hemisphere, declared in 1804. It was an achievement for the enslaved, but no one can deny that the cost was devastating. An estimated 100,000 black Haitians and 24,000 whites died in the struggle. Even so, the victory had a historic impact. Haiti had been one of the richest colonies in the world and a key pillar of France's economy, and its sudden loss rattled the entire colonial order. White slave owners everywhere were horrified by Haiti. For enslaved people and abolitionists, it was an inspiration, proof that enslaved Africans could fight and win their freedom. For slaveholding societies, Haiti was a nightmare come true, a violent overthrow of the old order. The Haitian Revolution fundamentally changed the conversation about slavery. It terrified slave owners in the American South and the Caribbean, who tightened their grip out of fear that another Haiti could happen on their soil. It also emboldened abolitionists in Europe, who pointed to Haiti as evidence that oppressed people would not stay oppressed forever. Haiti was the largest and most successful slave revolt in history, but it wasn't the only one shaking the foundations of slavery. 3 decades later, in 1831 and 1832, Jamaica erupted in a massive uprising known as the Baptist War, or the Christmas Rebellion. Around 60,000 enslaved Jamaicans, roughly 1/5 of the island's enslaved population, launched a coordinated general strike and armed revolt led by a Baptist preacher named Samuel Sharp. Plantations burned, and rebel forces clashed with colonial militias in fierce battles. The rebellion was crushed in about 10 days, followed by horrifying reprisals in which hundreds of rebels were executed. Yet politically, the impact was enormous. News of the uprising stunned the British public and Parliament, convincing many that slavery in the colonies had become impossible to sustain. Within just 2 years, Britain passed the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, freeing nearly 800,000 people in its Caribbean and other colonies, though many were forced into a short apprenticeship before full emancipation. Historians widely agree that the Baptist War was a decisive moment, pushing Britain over the edge and forcing the empire to confront slavery with fire, blood, and the undeniable will of the enslaved. There were numerous other revolts, including Gabriel's Rebellion in Virginia in 1800, Nat Turner's Rebellion in Virginia in 1831, uprisings in Barbados in 1816, and Demerara in 1823, as well as smaller revolts and conspiracies in Brazil, Cuba, and elsewhere. Most were ultimately crushed, but the pattern was unmistakable. The enslaved were never compliant. They resisted constantly, making slavery look increasingly unstable. By the 1800s, much of the Caribbean had majority slave populations, with enslaved blacks outnumbering whites by as much as 10-1 in some colonies. Any revolt could erupt into a widespread war. The scale of slavery in the Americas, massive plantations with hundreds of enslaved workers, and entire regions like Haiti or Jamaica, where 80 to 90% of the population was black and enslaved, created an explosive situation. Unlike earlier eras, where many slaves were scattered in households or small groups, these huge concentrations of people shared the same brutal conditions and a growing awareness of liberation ideas. The stakes of a rebellion were higher than ever. A single uprising could ruin a colony's economy or even topple its government. Those in power had to face the reality that clinging to slavery risked endless unrest and the threat of full-scale revolutionary war. But resistance didn't only come in the form of open revolt. Much of it was fought quietly in the fields, kitchens, and workshops of the enslavers. Enslaved people resisted their bondage in countless subtle ways, working slowly, feigning illness, breaking tools, setting fire to warehouses or crops, or poisoning masters' food. Such acts of sabotage and non-cooperation were impossible to fully stop. They hurt slave owners' profits in ways that are hard to quantify, but very real. A form of quiet economic warfare from within. Plantation owners wrote often about their frustration with slaves, shamming sick, or doing poor work on purpose. Slaves also maintained their dignity and culture in ways their masters tried to crush, holding secret prayer meetings, learning to read, or sustaining family bonds, all forms of resistance to the dehumanization of slavery. Thousands of enslaved people chose the path of escape as well. The moment there was any opportunity, many would run away from plantations seeking freedom. In the United States, these runaways formed a stream of fugitives heading north. This gave rise to the famed Underground Railroad, an informal network of safe houses and abolitionist allies that helped enslaved people flee to free states or Canada. Figures like Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave herself, became legendary conductors on this railroad, risking their lives repeatedly to guide others to freedom. Tubman alone rescued an estimated 70 people in about 13 expeditions and gave instructions to dozens more, earning her the nickname Moses. Every successful escape chipped away at a slave owner's wealth, since enslaved people were valuable property and their labor generated profit. As escapes increased, especially in border states, slaveholders grew paranoid. They spent more and more effort and money on slave patrols and bounty hunters to catch fugitives. Southern states enacted harsh laws, like the Fugitive Slave Act in the U.S., to punish anyone aiding runaways and to empower positives to hunt escapees even in free territories. All of this, the patrols, bloodhounds, hired slave catchers, was a growing expense and source of tension. It essentially militarized slaveholding regions as white populations armed themselves and formed militias dedicated to preventing slave revolts or escapes. In some places, every white male was required to serve in slave patrols by law. This amounted to an internal security state just to keep slaves in chains. The more violent and repressive the system became, the more it alienated observers and undermined any pretense of harmony. Any notion that slaves were content or naturally suited to servitude was shattered by the constant flight and fighting, and owners lived in fear on top of their piles of wealth. John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher, pointed out this paradox, that the slave owners were essentially the prisoners of the slaves because they had to devote so much effort to surveilling and controlling those they enslaved. This ever-present resistance made slavery look increasingly unstable and unsustainable. It's hard to run a profitable modern economy when you're also running a police state to guard your labor force. Now, to be clear, resistance alone did not end slavery, but it was a major force in bringing it down. Without it, slavery might have lingered even longer. Enslaved people's actions changed the cost-benefit equation. They made slavery more expensive, dangerous, and politically fraught. When you add that to the changing moral climate we discussed, you get a situation where large segments of society, even some pragmatic slave owners and politicians, began to conclude that slavery wasn't worth the trouble anymore. Abolitionist and formerly enslaved writer Frederick Douglass put it best: power concedes nothing without a demand. The enslaved people themselves were making a demand through their defiance, loud and quiet, every single day. So yes, morality and rebellion were crucial, but let's now talk cold hard economics. Slavery, for all its horrors, was an economic system. It existed for so long largely because it enriched those at the top. So what happens when that system stops making economic sense? In large part, slavery died because it lost an economic competition with a new system: industrial capitalism powered by free labor. In other words, when paid workers and machines proved more efficient and adaptable than slave labor, the economic rationale for slavery crumbled. Money talks, and by the 19th century, it was saying, slavery is bad business. This argument was actually made as early as 1776 by the famous economist Adam Smith. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote, "The work done by free men comes cheaper in the end than that performed by slaves." He wasn't appealing to sentiment. He was simply analyzing costs. Think of slavery from a purely business perspective. To have a slave, a master must buy the person, a large upfront investment, then feed, clothe, house, and guard that person for life. Enslaved workers have zero incentive to be productive beyond avoiding punishment. They can't be easily reassigned to new tasks requiring skills, and you can't downsize your workforce in a slump. You're stuck with the asset of a human being who must be cared for, however minimally. By contrast, a free laborer is paid only when needed, can be hired or fired, can quit if the job is not to his liking, meaning the employer has to offer at least enough wage or conditions to keep him coming, and often brings skills or can be trained in new ones. In a dynamic economy, especially one undergoing the Industrial Revolution, flexibility and innovation are key. Slave labor is incredibly rigid. You can't easily have slaves build railroads or work in a textile mill with complex machinery and then lay them off in a recession. But free workers will move, learn, and accept new employment conditions. Smith's insight was that in many contexts, especially in manufacturing and services, wage labor would outperform slave labor. We actually see this play out in historical data. By the 19th century, the regions that were booming economically were those embracing free labor and industrialization, not those clinging to slavery. Take Britain, for example. Britain was the first major country to abolish both the slave trade in 1807 and then slavery itself in its colonies in 1833. Critics at the time warned that ending slavery would ruin the economy. After all, the West Indies plantations were huge moneymakers. The British government even paid a gigantic compensation to slave owners in 1833 to reimburse them for the property they lost. 20 million pounds were paid out to former owners, an enormous sum at the time that amounted to roughly 40% of the national budget. And yet, Britain's economy did not collapse. In fact, it surged forward. The 1830s and 1840s were the peak of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. Textiles, ironworks, steam power, these drove GDP upward. Factories in Manchester and Birmingham didn't need slaves. They needed free workers and engineers. British colonies like India and elsewhere became markets for goods, rather than just slave work plantations. So despite losing free labor from slaves, Britain grew richer. Within a few decades, the value produced by industrial manufacturing far outstripped the old sugar islands. This lesson wasn't lost on observers. A modernizing economy could thrive without slavery. Look at the United States in the 1800s. The southern slave states were certainly wealthy in terms of cotton exports, but the northern free states were rapidly outpacing them in every other measure: population, technology, infrastructure, and diversified wealth. The North built canals, railroads, factories, and attracted millions of immigrants to work in its cities and farms. The South basically had one main product, cotton, and relied on the North or England for most manufactured goods. Some Southern thinkers feared that they were lagging. One famous Southern quote came from Texas politician Louis Wigfall, who declared, "We want no manufacturers. We desire no trading, no mechanical or manufacturing classes. As long as we have our rice, our sugar, our cotton, and our tobacco, we can command wealth to purchase all we want," a clear clinging to the plantation way. But this was short-sighted. By the 1860s, on the eve of the Civil War, the North's economy was far larger and more advanced than the South's, even though the South had produced great riches from cotton. The free labor system in the North was simply more adaptable and better suited to modern growth. After the Civil War ended slavery in America, the United States entered one of the fastest periods of economic growth in its history. The Gilded Age, roughly from 1865 to 1900, saw a boom in railroads, steel, oil, and industrial power. The absence of slavery did not hold the nation back. If anything, it opened the door to new forms of growth, even as harsh and exploitative labor conditions persisted. Meanwhile, the southern states, which had been the wealthiest region before the Civil War, sank into economic stagnation for generations. Their insistence on slavery, and later on a low-wage sharecropping system, left them unable to attract the immigrants and investment that fueled prosperity in the North and West. Even today, some of the United States' regional economic disparities can be traced to the divide between a past built on slavery and a system of free labor. Another telling case is Brazil, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. In the 19th century, Brazil's economy relied heavily on coffee, sugar, and rubber, and it continued importing enslaved Africans long after other nations had stopped. In total, roughly 5 million Africans were brought to Brazil, more than any other country in history. By the 1880s, however, Brazil was falling behind the world's industrial powers. When slavery finally ended, under both internal pressure and after many enslaved people had already fled or stopped cooperating, the country faced a late start in moving toward a modern economy. Some Brazilian elites recognized that clinging to slave-based agriculture was preventing the nation from diversifying and progressing. After emancipation, Brazil began to industrialize and saw a wave of European immigrants arrive to work on farms and in factories. In essence, modernization and slavery were at odds. You could stick with the old labor system, but you'd miss the train of progress. The countries and regions that abandoned slavery earlier leapt forward economically, while those that delayed, like Brazil and the American South, paid a heavy price for their stubbornness. It is also important to clear up a common misconception. Some assume slavery was ended because it was no longer profitable. That's too simple. In some places like Caribbean islands with worn-out soil, or the Upper South in the United States, where tobacco production was declining, slavery had become less profitable than before. But in other regions such as the Deep South, Cuba, and newly opened cotton lands, slavery remained highly profitable right up to the end. What truly shifted the balance was the rise of a different economic model that turned out to be much more efficient and sustainable on a national and global scale. Industrial capitalism changed everything. A growing capitalist class no longer wanted to be tied to the old plantation elite. They saw far greater opportunity in free labor, wage markets, and mechanization, which could fuel trade and industry without the instability and moral baggage of human bondage. It's a bit uncomfortable to accept that economics, and not morality, was the final nail in the coffin of slavery. We like to think people do the right thing just because it's right. But in this case, the right thing, abolishing slavery, also started to align with the practical thing. As historian Eric Williams argued in Capitalism and Slavery, asking why slavery ended is like asking why a business failed. Yes, it ran out of money, but that's tied to everything from bad products to new competition. Slavery ended officially when it lost the backing of law and when armies and navies enforced its end. But those political decisions were made easier because slavery was losing its competitive edge in the modern world. In a brutal sense, paid labor beat slave labor. The numbers finally flipped, and once they did, the high-minded moral arguments suddenly found a lot more takers among the powerful. Yet, it would be cynical to give economics all the credit. The moral conviction and the human suffering are what drove people to act against slavery, even when it was still profitable. Nowhere was this clearer than in the United States, where the issue of slavery led to an all-out civil war. A war not between slaves and masters, but between free states and slave states. The U.S. was almost unique in that it required a massive war among its own citizens to finally uproot slavery. So far, we've seen how moral pressure, economic change, and the relentless resistance of the enslaved all chipped away at the foundations of slavery. But the final death blow to the global slave system in the 19th century came through direct government action, pushed forward by those very pressures. No nation played a larger role in this than Britain, which was once the world's leading slave trading power, yet ultimately became the driving force in enforcing abolition on a global scale. In the early 1800s, fresh off the momentum of grassroots abolitionist campaigning, Britain took a bold step. It outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and then slavery itself in 1833 throughout its vast empire. But Britain didn't stop at cleaning its own house. It embarked on what has been called a global anti-slavery crusade, using its navy and diplomacy to pressure other nations into ending the trade and eventually slavery. This is a fascinating and often overlooked chapter. One empire, at its height, devoting significant resources to ending the practice of slave trafficking worldwide. One of the most powerful tools of the abolitionist movement was imagery. In 1787, British abolitionists published the now famous diagram of the slave ship Brooks, which showed 454 enslaved Africans crammed into the ship's lower decks like cargo. The cross-section revealed rows of human beings chained shoulder to shoulder, with barely 10 inches of headroom. It was a horrifying sight that made the cruelty of the Middle Passage undeniable. For the first time, ordinary people who had never seen a slave ship could truly grasp the inhumanity of the trade. The Brooks diagram spread rapidly, appearing in pamphlets, newspapers, and posters across Britain. Its impact was immediate. Within months, tens of thousands of Britons, from local church groups to town councils, added their names to petitions demanding an end to the slave trade. Public pressure on Parliament surged, fueled by this single, unforgettable image. Abolitionists like William Wilberforce, a British politician who became the leading voice for abolition in Parliament, seized this surge of moral outrage and turned it into action. Year after year, he introduced bills to end the slave trade, refusing to let the issue fade. After roughly 2 decades of relentless campaigning, Parliament finally acted. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 passed, making it illegal for any British ship or subject to buy or sell human beings in the Atlantic trade. Ending the trade was politically easier than ending slavery itself, since it did not immediately take enslaved people away from their colonial owners, but it was the critical first step toward dismantling the system. Crucially, Britain then took the extraordinary step of enforcing this ban on the high seas. The British Royal Navy set up the West Africa Squadron, a permanent naval task force patrolling the African coast, charged with intercepting slave ships. For the next 50 years, the West Africa Squadron hunted slave traders. They faced immense challenges. The African coastline was long, and smugglers used fast ships and various tricks like flying false flags or throwing slaves overboard if a warship neared. Still, the Royal Navy's mission persisted. They negotiated treaties with other powers to allow the right of search on suspected slavers. They gradually increased the squadron's size and improved its ships. Over decades, the West Africa Squadron seized around 1,600 slave ships and freed roughly 150,000 African captives from those vessels. These liberated Africans were usually taken to Sierra Leone, a British colony in West Africa founded as a home for freed slaves. There, courts adjudicated the captured ships. Life for the recaptives wasn't always rosy. Many ended up as indentured apprentices or soldiers in British service, ironically, but they were not delivered to American plantations at least. Britain paid a steep price for this effort. It's estimated that around 1,500 to 2,000 British sailors died on anti-slavery patrols, from combat or disease. The cost was huge. At its height, up to 2% of Britain's GDP was spent on naval suppression of the slave trade. Some historians note that at times the anti-slavery patrols amounted to half of the Royal Navy's operations. This is one reason the British tend to be proud of their abolitionist history, sometimes to a fault, overlooking their prior role in the slave trade. It was a unique commitment, and it did have an effect. The transatlantic slave trade gradually decreased after 1807, though it took decades. The U.S. also banned slave importations in 1808, the earliest allowed by its constitution, and other nations followed, but illegal smuggling continued. The Royal Navy's pressure, however, made it riskier and costlier. Slave ships had to use faster schooners and pack as many people as possible to turn a quick profit, which led to even higher mortality and eventually diminishing returns as more ships were caught. Britain also applied diplomatic pressure to end slavery itself. They leaned on other empires. Spain, under British pressure, outlawed the slave trade in 1817, although it continued slavery in Cuba until 1886. France officially abolished slavery in 1848, after Napoleon's earlier reversal of the first abolition in the 1790s. The Netherlands ended slavery in 1863. Brazil became a major focus of British pressure. British warships patrolled the Atlantic, sometimes even entering Brazilian harbors to seize slave ships, sparking diplomatic crises. One of the boldest moves came with the Aberdeen Act of 1845, which allowed Britain to treat Brazilian slave traders as pirates. The pressure worked. Brazil banned its slave trade in 1850, and over the following decades, a mix of internal movements and British influence pushed the country toward gradual abolition, which finally came in 1888. But one important point to remember is that British anti-slavery efforts were not purely altruistic. They served British interests in several ways. By shutting down the slave trade, Britain weakened the economies of rival slave-powered colonies in places like Cuba and Brazil, while claiming the mantle of moral leadership. The Royal Navy's anti-slavery patrols along Africa's coast expanded British naval dominance and gave the empire pretext to intervene abroad. Abolition became part of Britain's imperial self-image, tied to the idea of a civilizing mission, even when other motives were at work. Still, British action undeniably sped up the end of slavery in many regions. Most Latin American nations abolished slavery soon after winning independence, but Cuba and Brazil held on longer. External pressure mattered. Cuban slavery ended in 1886 partly because Spain faced international isolation and exhaustion from wars, including one where freedom was promised to enslaved fighters. In Brazil, the system collapsed 2 years later. By 1888, thousands of enslaved people were fleeing or refusing to work. The country faced diplomatic pressure, and Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law, ending slavery once and for all. By 1900, slavery as a legal, recognized system was gone in most of the world. Only a few holdouts remained. The Ottoman Empire, covering Turkey and much of the Middle East, banned the slave trade in the mid-1800s under outside pressure and formally abolished slavery by the late 1800s. Iran did not abolish it until 1929. Mauritania in West Africa holds the grim distinction of being the last country to officially outlaw slavery in 1981, and it only made slavery a crime in 2007. Even today, in Mauritania and some other regions, forms of bondage and human trafficking still persist, despite being illegal. Yet by the dawn of the 20th century, the global norm had flipped. What had once been accepted as part of life became, in the words of American writer Isabel Wilkerson, morally radioactive. No government today dares defend slavery as a legitimate institution, marking one of the most profound moral transformations in human history. So, credit where it is due. Britain, after profiting enormously from slavery, did more than any other single nation to push the world toward abolition. It was the first example of a powerful nation using international pressure for a human rights cause. But again, hypocrisy and self-interest were involved. Looking at all these factors, moral revolution, slave resistance, economic change, and political action, we can see that slavery didn't die of one cause alone. It was a multifaceted process, essentially 150 years of upheaval that turned the world upside down. The real reason slavery died wasn't because a single person like Lincoln issued an order. It died because humanity, led in large part by the oppressed and their allies, forced it to die. It was a complex convergence of conscience, resistance, and historical change. Next time you hear someone praise the end of slavery as a moral triumph, remember it was also the result of people rising up and demanding that triumph, often at great risk. It's a story not of a sudden moral awakening, but of struggle and ultimately progress over many decades. If this story opened your eyes, subscribe for more content that explores Black history, power, and truth. We reveal the parts of history that were buried and stories that were almost forgotten. Share your thoughts or questions in the comments, and thank you for watching and standing with us. Knowing our past is what gives us the strength to challenge injustice and shape a future that will never repeat these horrors.